Thank you very much for coming. I know there's lots of talks on at the same time, so I hope you find this talk useful. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dave Spencer. I'm the author of Gateway 2nd edition, and I am also still a teacher in a secondary school just outside Madrid. Okay, now this is talking about the flipped classroom, and flipped classroom, there's an important message to make at the beginning of this talk. Often in flipped classroom talks, we have things like upside down flipped text, okay? So this is very important. There will be no upside down text in my talk like this one, okay, because it's very confusing. Another thing, don't worry, because there will be no flipping of images either. So I would never think of turning my classroom upside down like this, okay? So don't worry about that happening in this talk. It will definitely not happen again, I think. Before I begin, it's very difficult to know how much you will know about the flipped classroom, if it's something that you are new to or something that you've been using and you are an expert in. To make sure that we're all on the same page, just very quickly, I want to sort of explain in 2 seconds what the flipped classroom is. And to do that, I think it's always a good idea to begin talking about what is a traditional classroom. And you'll notice, of course, that I've put traditional in inverted commas because we could argue about this for the rest of the day. What is a traditional classroom? I always give the example of, for example, a university lecture. And in that scenario, the teacher will come, the teacher will talk, for example, for 40, 50 minutes. The students will listen, and then there will be some sort of practice for homework, whether it's answering questions, preparing an essay, preparing a debate. But basically, we could say that the instruction happens in the classroom and the practice happens at home. And of course, the idea of the flipped classroom is that the instruction is happening outside the classroom, and inside the classroom, we have time for practicing, for maybe working in pairs, working in groups, and the teacher could be monitoring and giving individual attention to the students. So that's like a very, very, very simple explanation of what the flipped classroom is. And personally, I think the most interesting thing for me about the flipped classroom was where the original idea came from. And it was 2 teachers in the United States, Bergman and Sams, and they were teaching in a high school in the States, and they were teaching a science. I think it was chemistry. It was chemistry, biology, some science. And you may know that in the States, it is fairly typical that students may miss classes because they have, for example, sports events, they're maybe in a team. And what they discovered was certain students were falling behind because they were continually missing lessons. And so what they decided to do, or what they found they could do, was to record a PowerPoint with a voiceover, with notes on, and then they could make that available online. And that meant that the students who were missing class for various reasons could keep up with the rest of the class because they had this access to the lesson in a sort of digital video format. And I think that's like a really great example of a new digital solution to a problem that teachers have always had. I have a class of 20 students. If 2 students are away because they are ill, then it's a good way of making sure those students don't miss out on the content that you're teaching the rest of the class. What I think is really interesting is that obviously the students who missed the class found this useful, but what also happened was that students who were actually in the lesson, when they knew there was an online version of the lesson, they also re-watched it. And I'll come back to this in a second because UK universities are doing something similar where there is a live lesson and then you also have access to the recorded version of the lesson. So not only students who were missing could take advantage of the videos. And another like very simple practical solution for revision is that at the end of a term when you have a test, the students could look back at the videos because obviously as a teacher we don't have time to represent all of the things that you're instructing your students. Now when we were writing Gateway 2nd edition, this seemed like a great idea to incorporate into the book. And so what we decided, was that grammar is almost like the perfect thing to include in a flipped classroom because it's the part of the lesson where we particularly instruct. It doesn't have to be grammar. We could have chosen, for example, writing skills, explaining how to write an informal email. It could be vocabulary, but we decided to make grammar videos. The grammar videos are sort of short. They're between 3 to 6 minutes for the YouTube generation of younger learners. And they are integrated into the course so that they reflect directly the reading text that they've just done or the listening text. Now, I'm going to show you 2 minutes. So it's the second half of one video, just so you get an idea of the flipped classroom videos we have in Gateway 2nd edition. Just to explain the context, this is from a B1 plus level. It's teaching so and such, okay? Now, at the beginning of the video, I've explained so and such in the context of a reading, which is about supermarkets and the way that supermarkets sometimes use different tricks to make us spend more money, okay? For example, the smell of bread outside so that it makes you want to go inside. So I've taken that context from the reading, I've explained when we use so, I've explained when we use such. Now I'm just going to briefly explain how it fits into a sentence. In this short extract of the video, I'm going to ask 2 questions, and just so to prove that you have not fallen asleep, can you shout out the answers? Okay, so I ask 2 questions. They're pretty simple, I think, and can you answer the questions? Okay, let's have a quick look. After sentences with so or such, we can continue the sentence with that, like in these examples. So, let's check for a second. What word is missing here and why? So the answer is? The word is such because it intensifies a noun with an adjective. And here? So the answer is? The word is so because it intensifies an adjective, not a noun. Actually, I've just come back from the supermarket right now. But I'm so clever that supermarkets can never trick me into spending my money. But I must say that I was quite lucky today. Close to the checkout, I saw that they had a special offer on this cat food. It was 30% cheaper than usual. So I bought 15 tins. I don't have a cat, but it was such a bargain that I couldn't say no, could I? Thanks for watching, and see you again soon. Okay. Now, you can see from that I like my flipped classroom videos like I like my pizzas, like with extra cheese on top. So a little bit of cheesy humour, I think, is quite a good idea to keep secondary students interested, so they're going to watch till the end of the video. Actually, I must admit as well that once I did this video in a webinar, and I asked the teachers as well to answer so or such, and in fact 50% of people got it wrong, so that was a bit depressing for me as a teacher. So maybe my presentation wasn't clear, I don't know. What I want to explain now is that for me, so far, the idea of the flipped classroom is a great idea. It's a practical solution to different problems that all teachers have. Just to explain briefly, the people who created the flipped classroom went on to design something that they call flipped learning, or sometimes it's called flipped mastery, or flipping 2.0. And what the idea is here is that literally each student is working at their own speed. And basically, all of the instruction is always at home. So the students are always watching these videos, they're always then going into class and doing practice, but the teaching is always, literally always outside. What that means is that all of the students are then working at different paces. Once they've seen a video and they've proved that they've understood it and can use it, use the information, then the teacher gets those students to move on at a different pace. Now, for me, as a working secondary school teacher in a private school in Spain, I find that a little bit difficult to imagine doing because it's actually quite stressful for the teacher, but each student working individually, I think also presents a problem in terms of English language teaching. And what I want to look at is a few sort of things that we can question about an approach which is sort of a little bit more extreme in this way. The first thing to say is English is probably not the same as chemistry or history or geography or biology. And I think that that idea of a lecture situation where the students are listening for 50 minutes, does that look like your English classroom to you? Would you imagine sort of teaching for 50 minutes, your students are quietly, silently listening to you, and then they do the practice at home? Does that generally look? Not really, no? People's heads are shaking. I would say that it's possibly something a little bit more like this, where the teacher is doing some sort of presentation, and then if we're a good teacher, I think of English, the students will be doing some sort of practice. So imagine that we are doing grammar, the teacher will instruct, the students will practice, and then we will repeat the process, maybe going into more detail, or maybe we'll simply present something new. We'll present some language that the students need for a speaking activity, and then the students do the speaking. So I think the first problem with a strong flipped classroom approach for me is that English is not really a lecture type subject. And the problem with lecturing, so if the students are sitting at home listening to long lectures, I think that's a problem. Because a lecture is a lecture. There's a great quotation or an old adage, a lecture is a process by which the notes of the lecturer are passed into the notebook of the student without passing through the brains of either. And I think that's, that could possibly happen at university. It could happen in certain subjects. I know that in my school, the way that history is taught, which is probably badly taught, is something like this. Students listen to the teacher going on about information. And I don't think this is what we generally do in English classes. There is always the question that people say, it's the first question I think that most people ask, is what happens if the students don't watch the videos? I mean, that's a good point, isn't it? If the students haven't watched, for example, a grammar video, and we are expecting to practice immediately the next day, then what happens? And being a practicing teacher, I must admit that I've often heard lots of reasons for not doing flipped classroom homework. And I call this section Flipped Learning Avoidance, Key Excuses Made by Students, okay? Which is otherwise known as FAKE. So these are the things that students say to you when they come in the next day. You expect that they will watch the video, and these are some of the things that they say. Because we are now in the 21st century where the dog eating the homework is not quite the same anymore, okay? So first excuse, I forgot to take my tablet or laptop home, which is fair enough. If they haven't taken their laptop home, how can they do their flipped classroom video? I remembered my laptop, but I left my charger at school, which is, okay, step 2. I remembered my laptop and charger, but I forgot my password. That's another possibility. My laptop crashed. My laptop has a virus. The internet went. We're not quite sure where, but it went. I couldn't remember which unit you said to look at, which would be an easy way to get out of doing your homework. Unit 5, I thought you said unit 4. Watch it for homework, you said we were going to watch it in class. My mum wouldn't let me use my computer because she says I spend too much time online. And we're going to come back to this in a second because this is something that students do actually say quite a lot now in our school, and maybe the student has a point. I had to stop watching because I was getting dizzy from looking at the screen. The dog ate my pen drive, so that's another possibility. We do have lives outside school, you know. And obviously, this is sometimes, as a teacher, you actually feel bad about asking students if they did their homework, because then it's like, okay, I can't find it, but I did do it. Don't you believe me? Don't believe me. I don't care. So I think there are lots of reasons why students can invent or be genuine that they didn't actually watch the video. And I do think that it could be a problem, and it can be a problem when students are not watching the input. Then it means that basically, what do you do? How do you get around that problem? I think the school ethos can have a lot to do with this. If students are always reliable to do homework, then that's great. But I think we can generally say that in terms of the flipped classroom approach, a strong approach, then students have to be self-driven, responsible, and organized. And spoiler alert, this is if you don't teach teenagers, then those 3 adjectives are not usually the top 3 adjectives we use to describe teenage students. If you teach teenagers, I think you'll probably agree. I mentioned this excuse about not actually, parents not being happy about teenagers now looking at screens. And this is a really interesting article, which is 2019, so extremely recent, January. Online homework conflicts with parental limits on kids' screen time. So it is becoming an issue, I think, and it's one that we have to bear in mind in primary and secondary, is how much we want our students to be continually looking at a screen. And this is really interesting. It says here, the Pew Research Center, roughly half of 13 to 70-year-olds worried that they spend too much time online. And that's the teenagers are worrying. And it says here that they suggest that online homework may be partially to blame. And I think there is a blur for many students when they are working online with a computer. They don't know if they are working or if they're doing social media or if they're playing. And I think it becomes difficult for students, teenage students, and their parents to know what exactly the students are doing on their computer. Another thing that I think is important is the digital divide. Not all students do have access to internet, for example, at home. And I was thinking when I prepared this talk about particular countries, and yet just at the last minute before this talk, an interesting article which is very recent, March 2019. More than 5 million British people have never used the internet, but which is quite interesting, 700,000 secondary schools in the UK, students do not have a tablet or a computer to access the internet at home. Now, all of this is sort of maybe sounding a bit negative. What I think is the great thing about the flipped classroom is going back to the origins, is the fact that these videos are very, very flexible and they can be used to do lots of different things. And here are just like 7 ways that I think we can use instructional videos. You've noticed that I'm calling them flipped classroom stroke instructional videos. Basically, these videos could be watched as the flipped classroom approach suggests, as homework. And I think this is a great way of varying our homework in the year, that instead of sort of doing simple, I don't know, for example, written exercises, the students actually watch a grammar presentation or a vocabulary presentation in a video for homework. So we're varying their homework. Secondly, I think as the way that the flipped classroom began, it's a great tool for students who miss class. We can give them access to these videos and the students are not missing the input. Then also, the students who actually are there, they can watch again. So if there are things that they didn't understand, which is very typical when we present, for example, grammar, some of the students will understand immediately, some of the students will take a little bit longer, some of them will need to watch again and again. As a teacher, you cannot present the same grammar 10 times, but with a video, the students can watch again and again and again, as many times as they need. And again, I'll come back to this in a second, talking about UK universities. I hope you admire there in number 3 that I've got 3 Beatles titles. So if you're a Beatles fan, you'll notice there are 3 different song titles there. That's just for the Beatles fans out there, okay? We are in Liverpool after all. Number 4, we can use them as revision. So as, again, the Bergman and Sams, when they began using these videos, that's the way that they included one of the uses of flipped classroom. One thing that we know, and I'll show you some feedback from people who are using Gateway, is that the opposite of using these as flipped classroom at home is lots of teachers are using the videos like the one that I showed you. They're actually using them in the classroom. And I think the difficult thing about being a teacher is we have to do the same thing again and again, week after week, month after month. And I think having instructional videos that the teacher can use in class means that you can vary your presentations. And you'll notice that on a video, we can do things like highlighting, color coding, animation, visuals, timelines, all of those things which are more difficult to do on a blackboard, a whiteboard, but on a video, they really do stand out. I think another interesting thing about the videos is that they can be used by new teachers. So if you haven't actually taught a grammar point before, if it's your first year of teaching, you could always watch the video first to get an idea for how you want to do the presentation yourself. So you can actually maybe learn from watching the videos as a teacher. And then finally, I think they're particularly useful if you generally teach, for example, grammar in your L1. Then by having these grammar videos in English, it's a gentle introduction to using meta-language, grammatical instruction in English. It's non-threatening because the students can stop, listen again, and understand from the context. So for me, the beauty, if you like, of flipped classroom videos is that they're not really just flipped classroom videos. They're very flexible and can be used in lots of different ways. And maybe there are even different ways that I haven't even thought of that you've already thought of yourself. But here are 7 ways that you can do that. This is some feedback from different teachers who were using Gateway 2nd Edition. And the nice thing about the feedback is that it's actually it's incredibly similar to my list of 7 different ways that we can use them. I think teachers are just automatically using them in different ways that they find useful. So maybe they are using them as genuine flipped classroom videos. Maybe they're watching them in class. Maybe they are using them when students are missing because they're absent for illness or whatever reason. I just should point out that number 3 there, I find is interesting. Students are lazy and wouldn't play them at home, so we use them in class. So the teacher has already decided what would or wouldn't happen, but hasn't even tried. I mean, I would suggest trying to use them for homework and seeing what happens. And maybe sometimes our expectations are important in what then happens in the classroom. If we think they won't do it, then they probably won't do it. Right, and I once did a webinar, I think it was for Italy, and a teacher asked a question immediately after, which was, if this flipped classroom is instruction at home, do we actually need a teacher? And it's sort of one of those questions that sounds a bit silly or extreme. And I think, first of all, if you're doing flipped mastery, the teacher has to work harder than ever, in fact, probably, because you're immediately bouncing around the class, different people doing different things, and that's difficult. But then I suddenly thought, and maybe this has happened to you, YouTube videos, just 2 personal anecdotes, but one is that my son has never had 1 single guitar lesson in his life, and he's a brilliant guitarist. And he learned by watching YouTube videos. There are tons of them out there. You know, you can watch and you can pick things up from video. The other thing is that recently, about 1.5 years ago, there was a strike by lecturers in the UK. And interestingly, lectures are generally now always recorded and made available to the students after the lesson. Now, there is a question that the lecturers were worried because if they went on strike, students still had access to lots of lessons. And it sounds silly, but there is a question like, do we need the teacher if we have all of these instructional videos that are made online? The good news for us as teachers, this is from the King's College research, King's College London, that students do still basically prefer live lessons. And I think there are obviously good reasons why people like being in a class. Live is more engaging, and I think it is true that it's easier, obviously, to become involved in a live experience than to be interacting with a video. The fact that you can be distracted when you're working on a computer, when you're working at home. For example, point number 5, I think, is particularly important as English teachers, language teachers, social interaction. So a classroom is the great place to actually be connecting with other people, interacting with other people, and becoming involved with the teacher and fellow students. But I just wanted to finish really with some other research, which is showing what students at university, okay, do actually prefer. And number one is live lecture, and number two is watching the videos afterwards. But you can see very clearly from this graph that what is most popular of all is blended. And I think that's an interesting thing that will probably become more and more frequent in the future, that we have this live teaching as always, and then we've got videos which are then adding another element to our way of teaching, that by giving students access, particularly I think in the field of mixed ability, students who are maybe less able, who find learning grammar, for example, more difficult, learning writing more difficult, those students, by giving them access to digital materials, can then watch again and actually learn at their own speed. So I think the good news is that the future is probably blended, is what will become most common in most school situations, secondary school and university. Excellent. I think I'm sort of, yes, just about sort of like on time. Thank you. I would never think of flipping an image, as we said before, okay, but, and also you can see that I've really been to Liverpool, which is, you can also say you've really been to Liverpool. Has anybody got any questions? Because we've got just a couple of minutes. Would anybody like to ask any questions?
Yes. How do you deal with those excuses not watching it at home? Like, they might be true, right? So
yes.
You have to spend the time at the lesson and watch the video.
Yes, so just for everybody to hear, the question was precisely, which I think is one of the most common things as a secondary school teacher, what do you do with the students who don't watch the videos? Because as you've mentioned, some of those excuses can well be true. And I always say that it's more or less the same as when you, for example, set an essay for homework. Let's imagine, I think this is all about, that's why I mentioned the school ethos. I think this has very much to do with what you usually do in your class or in your school when a student doesn't do their homework. And I think the discipline techniques that you might use or the encouragement that you might use to make sure they do it will be the same as if it was a written piece of homework or as watching the video. I think the other thing which I didn't mention before is that what we're hoping, and particularly, which was why in the video that I showed you there is some interaction and there is a bit of humor, is that hopefully students will realize that watching the video is very helpful for them. Rather than being, you know, I think students sometimes see homework as punishment, and I think that watching something like a video like this would not be considered by the students themselves as punishment. So I think if the videos are interesting, useful, genuinely useful, I think most of your students will probably watch them. But I do think it's the reason why I personally wouldn't really go for a wholehearted, every lesson depending on the student watching a homework for video the night before, because it can be unpredictable. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any kind of feedback from students?
Well, the feedback from the students, the feedback that we saw was obviously from the teachers. To be honest, the most of the feedback that I've had sort of like face-to-face is that in these particular videos, the one thing they always mention is that they find them funny. I'm not sure if that's the most important thing about the video, but they find them entertaining. So that's what I get as feedback. I think for me, I mean, I think the other thing to mention about flipped classroom videos, for me, it's a success. Imagine you have a class of 25 students. Imagine that 3 or 4 of your students you find out are continually looking at these videos when they like. That for me is success, because it's something that we're offering that we couldn't offer before. And as I say, some students are less motivated in English, so maybe they never watch these videos, whereas others are more motivated, and without even saying anything, those students will watch the videos because they personally find them useful. And I think a certain amount of autonomy, I was joking before, but a certain amount of autonomy of students deciding, yes, I think this is useful, I think that's great if students do watch because they want to. Yeah. I think the key is it genuinely useful or not? Maybe one last question? Yeah.
You mentioned you teach in Spain.
Yeah.
And has it happened to you that students complain maybe they do not understand? Have you considered the idea of subtitling?
Yes, that is a good question. We've sort of thought about that, yeah, and you know maybe we will in the future. I mean, it's,
It may happen. I mean, and they're at home.
yeah.
Spanish teacher too. I wouldn't say in L1. I would say in the target language.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an option, isn't it? So the suggestion there was subtitling so that students can. What would be ideal, I think, is being able to choose if they use the subtitles or not so that they don't have to. But yeah, that's a valid point. I think the good thing about the video, of course, which is unlike live teaching, is the fact that they can stop and go back. One thing that I passed over quite quickly as well was that I would always suggest, even if you're using in a sort of strong flipped classroom mode, is always doing the first flipped classroom video at the beginning of the year with the whole class in the class so that they know how they can use them and what they can do with them. Yeah, but good point. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you do want to contact me or if you've got any questions, the Gateway Facebook page there, I always personally reply to any questions or any comments. So if there's anything that you would like to ask about, then feel free. And thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. At lunchtime, I'll be at the Macmillan stand mentioning a competition that we have, and do come along to that if you like. It's quite an exciting competition. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.